Just want to make some quick introductions. First, we have Dr. Stephanie Hare. She's a researcher, broadcaster, and author who focuses on technology, politics, history, and the world of work. And last year, she published the amazing book, Technology is Not Neutral, a short guide to technology ethics. And it was selected as one of the best books by the FT for summer 2022, and also by the readers as one of the best books in 2022 also. And she might sound familiar because she'll be up on BBC Radio or BBC News at times, depending on what the topic is at hand, especially recently with all the AI, with all various AI news reports. We have Nina Amini. She is an Australian, but currently living in Paris. She's worked across all sectors and for many sectors, and for 17 years in the Australian public service in particular, in a range of policy, program delivery, and strategy roles. And from 2016, her focus shifted to the use of design in digital and organizational transformation. And most recently, she earned a degree in research around design, and with her focus of research being on the use of design methods in organizational transformation in government. And additionally, she has been recently a visiting scholar at the Danish Design Center, and she has also advised OCAD in the area of innovation in government. And our last panelist is Ben Terrett. Ben is currently the CEO of Public Digital, as well as the Deputy Chair of the University of Arts London. Previously, he has been the Director of Design of the Government Digital Service from 2011 to 2015, where he led a multidisciplinary design team working across government on UK.gov. He is a royal designer for industry and was the first elected service designer. And in 2020, and this is when I first got to know him, he was as DNAD deputy president. He declined the presidency to make way for a more diverse appointment. So now I guess we can start our conversation finally. I've been waiting for this all morning. So my lead-in question, just to sort of set the foundation, when I started discussing this topic, there became somewhat of an intertwining or overlapping of politics and government in regards to design. Is there a difference between design and government and design and politics? If there's one, what would you say there is? So, Ben, could I lob it over to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Fee, and hello to everyone watching. I think for me, the simple definition is design in government is mostly about services and getting things done to help people get something done. Design in politics is mostly about campaigning. There is a difference there in that politics is often where a lot of policy is worked out, and I guess you could argue designed. But I think whereas government is where policy is delivered often rather than kind of designed and thought out. But yeah, I think broadly the kind of work of government is getting stuff done. And effectively you're talking about civil servants who have to deliver policies and things like that. And politics is much more about campaigning and sort of policy development and so on.
Nina, especially with all your work in civil service, would you be able to elucidate a little bit more too, from your perspective?
I agree with what Ben said. With politics in particular, I think what makes a politician is really their ideologies and what they're bringing from that perspective, whether, and I'm not an expert in this area, so it's not really my forte. However, I guess it really depends on what you mean by politics, because of course, then government is the implementing arm of whoever is the politician of the day in bringing whatever agenda they have to life through policies, through programs, and so forth. So I know about design in government, and I can comment on that. I have not worked in design in politics.
Stephanie, with your vision or perspective on politics and so forth, I'd love to.
Well, I was thinking that it might be helpful to get a bit of clarity around what we mean by design in politics, because I think somebody who worked in policy or political risk might think that they are using design to craft strategy. And so the difference for them wearing that hat might be the difference between strategy and then tactics. right? Like, how are you going to roll it out and who's doing what? So I enjoyed Ben's comment, particularly about like the role of civil servants and governments, where you're kind of operationalizing or productizing principles and having standards so that, because your audience in this case is a nation's citizens and residents and potentially even tourists or guests who are coming to visit. The UK has great design principles that you can use for digital government, but I'm sure probably in some other areas as well. I'm wondering if the people who feel that they are crafting policy and even law and thinking of that as like a political design vision, they might be thinking that from their perspective, design is about their values, which is political. And therefore, we'll see that play out in the election that's going to be coming soon. So I'm kind of throwing it back to all of you to be like, how would you articulate the difference really? Because I feel really clear on how design works in government, because I think there's like an end product to it, or an experience or a tool, something you get to end up using. Is the problem that vision or ideology or policy can feel a bit more nebulous?
I can go first. I think I don't have a very easy answer to this, but I feel like you can't really separate out politics from working in government either, because, and when I say that, I'm talking about, I can ground it in my area of expertise, which is using design either in digital transformation or in organizational transformation, specifically in government. And so, of course, in that context, there's always politics, because any designer has to deal with a range of different stakeholders. And part of that would be politicians, part of that would be the broader politics of the day. But then you can even bring it down to the politics within the organization. So I think politics definitely plays into it in the context of how designers have to bring different perspectives and different stakeholders together to solve a particular problem. I'm kind of dodging your question, by the way.
Ben, what do you think?
I think you can, certainly for the purposes of this discussion anyway, you can separate the political from government, where government means delivery of policy, because that very rarely is political. But there may be policies that are political, like the one that's in the headlines at the moment, the kind of Stop the Boat UK thing, migrant immigrant challenge. That's a very political policy. But the work of most bits of government is things like renewing your passport and paying your taxes and renewing your driving license and whatever. And I don't know, 95% of that is not political at all. It's just things the state does, and people need help getting those things done. So I think that, and there's a design element there to make that stuff user-centered and easier and simpler and more joined up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is then another aspect of policy development where I think it is helpful to have designers involved at a very early stage, so they can use the kind of design thinking, I suppose, tools, or the way they work, the way they think, to try and make that policy better. Again, I still think very little of that is actually political. And then there's a political element, which is drawing very distinct views on issues of the day that are distinct from my political opponents. For what, because maybe it's because we believe in it, maybe it's because we want to be different, just to be different, but whatever. But that's a very sharp political angle, and I don't. All these things would benefit from designers to some degree, but I don't think that necessarily needs designers there. So I think there are kind of pure political plays that don't need involvement. I actually probably don't benefit from having any external involvement. Just one of the reasons you are voting for politicians is because you like to believe they have an ideology and they think X and you think Y, or whatever. That's sort of what they're for, is to make those different opinions. But then there are other levels that I just mentioned where it's helpful to have designers involved. I think all of this probably just worth saying, all of this is again separate from, there's a very, very obvious role for designers and creatives and marketeers in campaigning politically. And the most recent high profile example I can think of is Hillary Clinton, the Hillary Clinton campaign, where the graphics is largely done by a chap called Michael Beirut, who's a very well-known graphic designer and had quite a distinct style. The other Western UK example is probably New Labour in 1997, which is effectively a rebranding of that party in a pretty traditional corporate sense of the word, new visuals, new name, new image. But there was a big, very deliberate rebranding there and repositioning, which I think if it didn't have designers, I mean, I wasn't around, but if it didn't have designers involved, it certainly had creatives and that way of thinking, as in we can, and by that I mean we can carve out a new area, both in policy and in visual and in look and in name and all those things that you might advise a corporation to.
And one of the things, as you were saying, that sparked for me was that during the pandemic, we saw Rishi Sunak, who was chancellor at the time, putting out policies, but he branded it with his own signature, which was quite controversial from what I remember at the time. So I don't know if anybody had ever seen it. It was clear he was essentially angling for something a bit more. He really wanted to be personally identified with those policies and make sure that everybody knew, he wanted credit for that. I don't know if that's come back to bite him later, but that was a really interesting departure from what I would have expected from government versus politics.
Yeah, that's you're absolutely spot on. There were lots of very social media friendly graphics with his logo / signature. Very interesting. He was quite he was almost quite explicit about that, wasn't he? And a similar thing happened, I think, with Liz Truss, actually. She was very good at branding herself to a certain part of the Tory party. I even remember reading something about how she always, in the couple of years before she was prime minister, she always wore something red, white, or blue. And if you went, and this article went back through, various, not just outfits, but situations she was in, and those photos and those scenarios she was in were very carefully managed, actually, when you went back and look at it. And there's definitely some, branding or creative person advising on that and helping to position her to that certain audience. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing. I mean, I think politicians have always been doing that, right? They've always been positioning themselves and working on their image. But I think now there are, frankly, just younger politicians. I mean, Rishi Sunak is younger than me. There are a younger, Liz Truss is older than me by 7 days, not like it's a thing I count or check or anything. But there are younger politicians who are just, more attuned with things like social media and image and so on and so on. So you'll definitely, that's not going away. You're going to see more of that.
I guess one has to question why. Why are we interested in design and politics?
Well, I mean, one thing could be if you are a politician and you're looking to differentiate yourself as you're preparing to, go into an election, or you're maybe not even going to go for this election cycle, you're playing a longer game. You want to be thinking about what are the most effective ways that you can be communicating your message or meeting and building your community. I mean, it's interesting what you just said about Liz Truss, her branding, talking to a certain part of the Tory party, because that ability to differentiate and target different audiences, I suspect, is probably quite key. This is not my area of expertise. I'm just guessing, and certainly as a citizen, you sort of notice it. And I think one of the things that I get nervous about as an ethicist is, like, obviously with generative AI technologies and deepfakes, what that's going to do to campaigning. And again, design principles, like how you would build that in to be like, do we need to regulate these campaigns now, so that if designers want to do an attack ad or put something out, does it have to be true? And do you watermark it in a way? How are you going to keep that integrity and faith in elections and fight misinformation and even disinformation? Design potentially could play a part of that as much as regulation. There has to be some way of letting voters know that what they're seeing is real. I think is going to become an issue more and more.
You think it could almost be in a way of like a non-negotiable, like a British Standard Time, where we're integrating the design into everything. so that, you know, but yet at the same time, by doing that, like, how could we get that, that mind shift? What would you propose to do that mind shift? Because it would be a big transition, because so often it's like we're seeing the deep fake with the Givenchy jacket on the Pope right now, walking around, and there's that level, but people, my question is, I think, is like, how can we make that shift though, if we're going to go down that path, like, as you're saying, Stephanie? So is that possible even too, within the minds of the politicians and in how they, you know, in this pursuit, like, is that possible to have something like that?
Well, you and I both know, coming from the US, I'm not sure how it is elsewhere, and I can't actually claim to have paid attention to it here in the UK, despite living most of my adult life here. But in the US, when a politician runs and puts out like a TV ad, it has to say, this ad is like, you know, officially approved. I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this ad, right? You know, they have to like mark it as, this has come from us, it's an official ad. Now, that's not, of course, the only type of advertising that Hillary Clinton in this case, or any other politician, would have done. And there's dirty ads and dark ads, and obviously anything on social media is different. That might only be for television or radio that they even are required to do that. This may be a case, and again, I'm well out of my lane here, so please jump in, anyone who knows the answer. It may be a case of, this is yet another thing we're going to have to update now that we have such communication with audiences over apps, over social media. We have this deepfake issue. Are we going to have to completely update this to protect elections? I feel like I would know if this was already in place, but I may not. So if anyone does, please correct me.
I don't think there's anything in place in the UK other than the standard Advertising Standards Authority, you know, type of regulation. I think there is a party political broadcast version of that, but it's effectively the same thing. I don't think there's anything new or specific, certainly not around deep fakes or anything like that. I think there's no question we live in an era of misinformation. And you've just seen, you know, I don't know, 5-6 years of that pretty strongly, and you're going to see more of that with AI and so on and so on. I don't have any smart ideas on how you combat that, other than I think people get better at spotting. I do think people evolve and get better at spotting that stuff, but we're definitely living in an era of you know, misinformation. Absolutely.
I want to make a point though that again, coming back to why have design in politics other than from a marketing angle and a campaigning angle. I'd like to argue that actually more important to have design in government, because the designers in government that are looking at implementing various policies and programs will completely outlive whatever political cycle there is. Politicians come and go. If you've seen anything of the Australian government, happens a lot more regularly than other places, more frequently than other places. And so really, for longevity of the effort, design effort that's put into trying to make better services and better policies, you do want to perhaps focus more on using design in government, because I don't really understand the purpose of using design in politics other than that campaigning and making sure they win the election. What is actually the purpose there of using design in politics?
Yeah, I think I agree. Let's talk about design in government, where it's much more about delivery of policy. And I think something that I saw when I worked in government, and you still see now, is there is a huge, it doesn't matter which political party is in, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. You see a huge disconnect between policy and delivery of that policy on the ground. And everyone is frustrated with this, from politicians to civil servants to, you know, citizens. And one of the things that design can do is to help bridge that gap and help that implementation get much more real and therefore, you know, get better. And I think design is designers are good, things like prototyping or testing or user research or etc. Whatever. But those things come very naturally to designers, and too often policy is written in small rooms on sides of paper and just hand chucked over the wall to a delivery team, whether that's a website or a team on the ground or face to face, whatever. That just happens too often, and I think that happens all over the world. And again, I don't think it matters what political party you're from; it makes no difference. But design can definitely help with that, I think.
So this might be sort of taking it off topic a little bit, but with that, then would it make a difference if, I know maybe I brought this up yesterday when we were chatting, but would it make a difference if we actually had a designer who was on the commons, who was in the Capitol, like somebody who was in the ground, not just the policy, but somebody who was, in a role that actually is more outward facing in the government? Could that make a difference? Or would designers be able to do that even? Or would they have the capabilities? I'm just wondering about that.
I don't think it'll make any difference at all. I can elaborate. I don't want to hog the airways, but I can elaborate. I think because it's a bigger, more systemic problem than that. So you could have one designer in the House of Commons or in the Capitol, whatever. It wouldn't make any difference. It really wouldn't make any difference. You'd need 50, and even then, it wouldn't make any difference, because those people would be better placed being in very senior jobs in the civil service, more operational roles. And their government is so big, even in the UK, you need 100. Of those to sort of really make a difference, really. And you need a change in culture rather than just kind of an individual. I suppose just to play this out, it may make a difference if you had a prime minister who was a designer and who said, look, I really want to force some of these techniques and these ways of thinking through, and I'm going to kind of stand on that ticket, if you like, and get campaigned on that. And if people voted that person in, that might work. But I honestly think if you had a designer at the cabinet table, for example, it just wouldn't make any difference. Just like you have people at the cabinet table now, or you have people in government, one or two that have got science degrees, doesn't make government treat science any better than it used to. So you need you need much more than that. And I think what you really need is designed to be valued inside the operations of government, so that there are senior design jobs in all the different departments, paid comparatively with private sector design jobs, and given the kind of mandate and the freedom to implement those ways of working and those ways of thinking. And actually, in the UK and other countries, you do have that. You sort of have that digitally. You have lots of designers in government now in the UK. Mostly at more junior positions, but you have lots of designers working in digital, working in government, and you are seeing, services are getting better, and they're getting better over time, and they're sort of still getting better. But you're not seeing it across all of government in everything government does.
Do you feel, in a way, if looking towards other countries such as Finland, like I know it's a city, but Helsinki has this CDO. So if and UK used to have the design council, but we don't really have anything in that capacity. But if we had a CDO in some capacity, could that make a difference? Or having more of a focus and somebody who's really focused like that?
I can talk about this a little bit from an organizational perspective. So my thesis was looking at the use of design methods in a government agency to transform it. And I used the framework of a professor at Aalto University in Sweden, Björklund, and her colleagues. And it's looking at the depth and the width of design within an organization. Depth being deep expertise in design. So we can talk about different types of designers, interaction designers, content designers, service designers, and so forth, where they have depth in their specific area of design, and then the width of design. And one of the aspects of the width of design in an organization is the scaffolds that basically support and coordinate design functions within an organization. And so it's more about the appreciation and the understanding of the applications of design across the organization in structural elements, in cultural elements, in strategy, and so forth. And so one of the key things of this research that they had done was about how do the depth and the width of design co-evolve together to finally reach a point where design can be sustained in an organization. And so I applied that framework to the research I did within an organization. And one of the things that I found was it would be really good to have a function in an organization, and I guess in this context, it's like a CDO, who could oversee all of those, both the depth and the width, and bring it together and basically be the custodian for that. But at the same time, I can see how there's a bit of a trend started in the private sector, and now you see it also in public sector organizations where they do hire CDOs, but then they don't seem to have the right level of knowledge of design. So what are they doing? Are they just ticking a box, following a trend? Oh, we've got a design officer, so we must be a great organization. We're very design driven. So I think it's not just about creating that role, it's also making sure that that role or function, I'm not saying it's necessarily a person, would have all the right expertise to bring those different levels of depth and width together and being able to shepherd the co-evolution of it. So if you then bring this up a level to a societal level, so bring it outside of an organization and say, okay, if you look at it from a government perspective, should we have a CDO in government? I would say potentially the same principles would apply.
I think you touched on something really interesting there, Nina, which is cities and things that are smaller than countries, because what I see in our day-to-day work is that certain countries, mostly in the West, I would say, but maybe not, but because we work all over the world, but some countries, it's just impossible to get anything done. It doesn't matter who you are or what you're going to do. And the power and the delivery is in cities or states or boroughs or councils or whatever, but basically smaller units that can be more agile and can get things done. Cities are the most quoted example of this, but I think you take the US, for example, it's much easier to get something done at a state level than it is at a federal level. And lots of that, actually, you are seeing cities and states and people take design more seriously. And maybe to be honest, that's probably a better way to do it. You know, you're more able to get stuff done. You're more nimble because government is just so big and so cumbersome that's impossible for anyone to get anything done anywhere in the world. You know, so I think some of these smaller structures are a better place to get started.
I agree. I think looking at it more from a local level is much more effective because you have better context of what are the problems you're trying to solve, and you know, in comparison to a bigger beast like a country where it just gets too complicated. Absolutely agree.
And also, given that most people live in cities, and that's the trend that's going to be happening over this century, it also becomes quite interesting. And I guess I was just thinking, you know, I think a lot of us talking in London, how would we see, like, could we think through, would it be useful to think through, like, how would London be improved if this city had a chief design officer? Like, what would we want to see them tackle? Because you both have, you know, and obviously Bea as well, the experience of seeing this in private sector, in governments already. If you could have your dream job, you know, like, we're going for it, what would you want that person to do?
I would like the person to look long term. So we obviously have some urgent issues to address, but a longer time horizon than any political party cares to take interest in. So when we're talking about climate related issues, or, you know, yes, of course, you get some governments that seem a little bit more pro climate and taking more action than others, but it is an urgent issue. It needs attention. And because it's a longer time horizon, it's hard to get government behind it. So I actually wanted to come back to something Vi said earlier about the Design Council in the UK, which you mentioned was part of the UK government, but isn't anymore. And I wonder, on reflection, which is what designers are good at doing, what is it that we learned from that? Because what I see as a non-British citizen from the outside is I love the work the Design Council is doing, designing for planet, and I've attended a couple of their conferences, and I love that. But are they able to have that autonomy and look at some of these issues because they aren't linked to government? Or I don't know. It's interesting to get your views as British citizens of how you've seen that evolution over the last few decades.
I would bet on with you.
Yeah, that's a good provocation. I mean, from my understanding, I could be wrong, but my understanding is the Design Council was set up post-war to effectively promote British design, which is primarily physical artifacts, like product design and a bit of architecture and so on and so on. And it was at its strongest probably in the 60s or 70s, to the extent where it had a physical building and a sort of shop / exhibition space on Haymarket in Piccadilly where you could go in and see products and things. And there was a kite mark thing that was associated with the Design Council. I can't remember if they actually created it, but it's kind of when you had this kite mark on things, you were supposed to think, oh, that's well designed, that's got this kind of seal of approval. And it was very successful. And then it sort of dwindled over time, post-80s. It just kind of dwindled. And then I think the big change that you just referenced there was in the coalition government came in sort of post-banking crisis in 2010, they cut its funding completely. So it'd gone from being a sort of almost completely government body to having funding and having to raise funding and so on and so on and so on. The funding had dwindled and then it got cut completely. So it is independent now, which I guess is possibly is useful on some things. But I think that the thing it's lost is because government doesn't give it any money, it doesn't need to pay any attention. So the thing they always had, even when it got 1 or 2% of its funding from government, was you could find a minister who would talk to you because they're giving you money. So, and I think they still can get ministers to talk to them. Obviously, they're a very well-known organisation, but I think that link has been broken. So, which is a shame. I think it would be good if government still had a connection there. However, maybe it does allow them to be more important. That's a good point of view. Just coming back to your question about cities and what would a sort of chief design officer for a city do? I'm trying to think on my feet, but I think one good example from London where I think it would have benefited from a chief design officer is the kind of rise of sort of low traffic neighborhoods and LTNs and the kind of post-pandemic implementation of cycle lanes and various other things, which, I'm a fan of that. Many people aren't. In fact, I think I've only ever met about 5 people that are a fan of those things, but I'm a fan of those things, but they do seem to have not been implemented in a kind of joined up way. It seems to be quite piecemeal and, successful in some areas, not successful in other areas, great consultation with local communities in some areas, not in other areas. There's no kind of consistency of implementation or even sort of interface or how you navigate these things. So I think if you there's one where I live and it's great and you get to know it very well and it works really well. But if I travel to another part of London, it can be incredibly confusing if you're going there for the first time, both as a cyclist and pedestrian and as a driver, whatever. But that feels to me like a more design driven approach, or maybe a chief design officer could have said, this is a big opportunity. Let's make sure there are, and I think the approach would be consistent, not uniform. They don't have to be exactly the same, but let's make sure there's a joined up approach to designing these things and implementing them. So that just strikes me as one example where a designer at a very senior level could have helped.
Well, even just to piggyback off of that, then I was talking with Hannah Harrison, who's the Hannah Harris, who's the CDO of Helsinki. I remember I connected with her because I was doing some decolonizing work, and they were looking into decolonizing, especially for like hiring practices within civil service and designing something that was ethical and equitable too. So even from that perspective, when it's more of the not just the infrastructure, but it's also the cultural element within the city, especially when you're seeing, like up in Finland, it's becoming much more diversified with the influx of immigrants. So there's that level too, especially we're such a multi-dimensional, diversified city. There is some of the cultural levels here in the UK or even the US, we could say, that maybe inhibit the diversification of roles. So that's another element I've always viewed a CDO could potentially do too, and help actually with becoming much more of an equitable society by the hiring standards within the civil service even, or anybody who's in the mayor's office, like having that standardization. So it can not just be, when you look at the org charts, it's also more than just a certain profile.
I was thinking last summer when we had that horrific heat wave where it was like almost unbearable in the city and really difficult to sleep. And I think everybody got a taste of what is coming. One of my friends who lives in South London, messaged me and said that she's got this area near her apartment complex where it's all cement. And she was saying, why can't we rip this up and turn this into, you know, a local garden and plant trees, which would cool the neighborhood down? She was like, the heat that is coming off of this is, you know, it's not just the air that's happening now. It doesn't even cool until very, very late in the evening, if at all, and then it gets baked again. And why have we built this? Why don't we even have like urban farming, or, you know, the people in the neighborhood could like turn this into allotments? Like, who thought this through? And I love that idea of what you were saying earlier about the joined up thinking part and like citizens juries, even, of how do we get people involved to propose ideas that they want to see local, actionable, probably even not requiring a huge amount of investment in their neighborhood, and where they can leverage best practice around the city in case people have already done that, and like learn from each other and form groups. Because I felt like that was one of the things during the pandemic, and then a little bit last summer, we could be capitalizing more on the fact that in the past few years, more people talk to their neighbors now than probably ever in this city. And more people are aware of what's going to be happening with climate, what's already happening, our food supply, cost of living crisis, shortages, just feeling a little bit of empowerment and maybe growing your own stuff or cooling your own neighborhood down or creating places that don't have the same, you know, pollution. I would love to see that angle taken on as well, and how that kind of design thinking works in. So you have to get also buy-in from people from the ground up, and it helps that they're co-creating.
There are some initiatives happening particularly around Europe, around smart cities, and I think it's EU funded, even some of the initiatives, but I've definitely been in conversations where some of these things are happening. There's a really interesting, oh gosh, I can't remember his name, happening in Bologna in Italy, for example, where they're using, this is actually Cassie Robinson is a British person, and Indy Johar also, who talks about imagination infrastructure and bringing community together to solve some of these problems. And I think Bologna is a really good example of a city that is doing that really well in co-creating the solution. So when you say bring in the civil society in designing the outcome of what they want, that's exactly what they're doing. So I think there's some really good examples to learn from, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said just like sparked that, you know, why limit ourselves just to what we're doing in our own city in terms of talking with one another, which is already such a challenge in a place of millions of people. You're so right. We could be talking to people in Bologna or in Paris, another city that's really turned itself around in terms of greening and, you know, changing public transport and bicycles, and thus pollution. Or even like one of my friends was the chief digital officer of Melbourne, and she was talking about how they had email addresses for all of the trees, and people would be writing letters to the trees about how much they love them. And she said that was lovely, and like the media picked that part of it up. But the reason we actually created email addresses for the trees and are monitoring them is because we view this as one of our like assets for climate change and fighting it. We're doing urban cooling, and we need to be able to monitor our tree cover. So it had this other effect, but like teaching people how they can even understand what's happening to the temperature in their neighborhood and what would happen to it if more trees were planted, or what other types of buildings could happen. So they could play with it and see what would happen. Could be fascinating. Or, you know, just a neighborhood, again, I'm looking at allotments just because I know so many people who've been affected by the cost of living. If you could start to control some food supply a bit better, it's not going to solve everything, but just a little bit, how much the neighborhood could potentially save over the course of a year would be fascinating. But I don't know how easy it is for people to visualize ideas and change. And that's where designers are so powerful. I mean, one of the many ways they're so powerful. Oh, V, I think you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. I turned it off because it was with some rustling moving. So on that note, Stephanie, I'm just wondering, because somebody just posed this question in the Q&A about how can we increase the value of design to government politicians? So I'm thinking, especially when you're doing more of those local council level, there are, you know, I know there's this digital designers embedded in the different councils and all, but I'm wondering if even furthering the increasing the value of design to these roles, if that would help with these initiatives that you're referencing, Stephanie, if that would, or how could we do it?
Say more things. Like, what do you mean?
So how can we, so basically, yeah, so I was spitballing and just thinking out loud, but how can we increase the value of design for government and politicians, especially when you're talking about more of these local levels? And I know it's more of the local community, it's taking cues from like John Alexander and citizens, but I think overall, to have that overall impact, how can we, like, what's the difference of, or how can we educate the politicians and government so they can understand the fuller gamut of the impact of this, of design and so forth, so we can have the impact at these lower levels and make it more effective, and maybe also I guess you could say longer term impact too. And so I'm just like wondering, because I think there's like a disconnect I'm seeing. Like we have the local and we're talking about government and so forth, and there's a lot going on there, but is there that, how can we do that, that value piece there? So there's that click almost. Is that making sense now?
Yeah, thank you. It made me think, as you were saying, how can they see it, was, you know, the good old dashboard. But it's true, like the dashboard doesn't have to just be drawing on existing data. It can also be like a way for people to play with scenarios, and politicians could also do that. You know, so they could look at their constituents and point to them and say, if we had, I'm going to pull out the most ridiculous examples here, but you know, if we had the same tree cover as the people in Hackney did versus here in Camden, you know, like here's the difference that's making in terms of you know, heat throughout the neighborhood during the months of July and August, or conversely, places to go for people to warm up when it's really, really cold in winter. Like, is that distributed equitably or not? So you could look at it from like an equity point of view, or is it fair the way that we do allotments? My understanding is that a lot of that comes from like World War II or possibly even earlier. I know in my neighborhood, like you can't even get on the allotment waiting list like 25 years or something. It's just like not even, you know, so you kind of wonder like, how is that equitable? That's like, surely that's punishing younger people, young families, people who maybe need it more than somebody who's doing it as a hobby. But not to knock that, that's great. But like, should you be able to hold on to it forever? Could you potentially go to a different part of the city if you were willing to travel? Just how is that made transparent? Because I think, again, a lot of it is maybe there's data that's there, and in that case, it's just a case of pulling it and displaying it in a way that's easy to intuit and also to play with. But it might also be like allowing you to play with certain parameters that you could see what could happen if you wanted to change based on conditions that you could set, just so that you could imagine and craft policy. You could use it as a tool to help politicians craft their policies and be in better dialogue with their constituents. So now, traffic would probably, I'm sure, be like a real crowd pleaser on that one, and crime, right? Or even like bin collection, right? It makes me think of that organization, My Society, which does some really great stuff on local level. And it's great because all you have to do is know your postcode, right? You don't have to use your own address or anything personal for you. But if you want to check out what's happening in your local area, you can, but can you compare easy? And also that's not being done by government, that's being done by like a third party. It'd be interesting if government worked with them or fed that into some other stuff that they were doing.
Sorry, I'm going to have to leave in about 2 minutes, but I just wanted to say something here, because one of the things we are talking about here is how do we, in a way, educate politicians about what design is and what benefits design can bring, and the value of design, which has been quite a conversation for many years amongst designers. How do we prove the value of design? And I guess it's one of those things, I don't know about you guys, but for me, it's always an issue when somebody asks me, what do you do? And I have to be really careful about, do I introduce myself as a designer? Do I introduce myself as a public servant? Because quite often, unless I'm very specifically in an environment of designers, people don't know what it means when I say I'm a designer. And I always ask, do you know what I mean? I'm not talking about graphic design. I'm not talking about interior design. I'm talking about it in this context. And often people just nod and say, yeah, I do understand, but they don't. And so I imagine that politicians don't either. And so it's a hard sell. I mean, I'm interested how, on one hand, you think, well, design is a relatively new discourse. And yes, you know, there are different incarnations of design, as the, you know, the interdisciplinary nature of it, and how in the 20th century it started entering into the management discourse. And but you know, like how do you describe design? How do you describe what you do? And then how can you sell that to politicians and the value that you would bring? It's a hard sell. It's my everyday life, I struggle with it. I don't know. I don't have a clear answer to this.
Yeah, that's a great question. The term design is just too broad to be useful in most of these cases, I think. And I think what individuals or small groups should do is create trust, build trust. And I think that's, in my experience, that's the only way to. Everyone gets the value of design. You know, politicians, whatever you might think of them, they are smart. They know that good design is better than bad design. You know, so at that abstract level, they get it, but they've very rarely seen it or experienced it or benefited from it. So I think if you can use design on a project that such a politician is passionate about, and then say, this is how this helped, you know, and then you build that up, and then you win that trust, and you know, you can then use that trust to say, hey, there's this bigger thing we want to do, the same way you would with a client, you know, to be honest. But it takes a long time, and I think one issue is politicians don't stick around very long. Unfortunately, they're gone in a couple of years, so you can spend a lot of time building trust with one, and then they're gone. But I think you just have to build trust, and you build trust by delivering lots of small things of high quality, and then adding that up to have a bigger picture. I think the mistake designers make is always, in every aspect of life, in my opinion, is that thinking other people care about design, and often they don't. They'll care about whatever it is they're trying to get done, whether that's sales or policy or whatever. And if you can show them that you can help do that via design, they're all ears. But you have to do that and then build up that trust, and then go back and say, okay, we want to do more of this. And in my experience, people will be all ears then.
Few more minutes. There's one more question that just came through, Ben and Stephanie, that I would love just your insight to very quickly. So it's framed up as, I think in order for things to change with policymaking, we also need to understand why current systems are being upheld and who benefits. How do we get policymakers to change from reductionist thinking to systems thinking? And they're just curious to see what you think, that they posed it as to the panel.
I guess, I mean, there's the two levers of like fear and opportunity. There's like the classic one. I've got a friend who works at government digital services who said, I think they've gone through like a complete reorganization of that department, like 4 times the past 4 years or something. It was just like crazy. And one of the observations that the civil servant was saying to me was like, it's really difficult to ever implement policy if you're just constantly going through these reorgs, et cetera. So I think there's helping people understand the consequences of when a system is not, when you say like systems thinking, when a system is not even being allowed to be a system, it just, you know, keeps falling apart or fragmenting. And I know that government ministers want to make their stamp and make their mark, but there's also perhaps something about we need time. So it's not just, you know, we have to join everything up, etc. We also need to like allow time to work and to make that journey really clear for people and measurable. So I think I would probably want to talk to them about that. And I know private sector companies love to do this too, but I'm mentioning that because I've had someone genuinely say this has been so difficult. We could get so much more done if we weren't constantly reorging.
Yeah. I think on the systems thinking, how do we get people to think systems thinking, whatever, that's very, very hard for people to do. It's very hard to think like that. It's very hard to think holistically like that. It's even harder when you're working government on the politics side and you know you're not going to be around for very long. Like you might be a politician for your career, but you're going to move department in a couple of months. So it's very, very difficult. And I think something that where designers can help, something designers are really good at is things like a service map or a user journey, or just showing visually and highlighting that end-to-end journey. Designers are really good at that, and service designers particularly. We've got lots of good ones at the RCA. Things like service maps, in my experience, blow people's minds when they see all these things exposed. They don't realize how connected these various bits are, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're really practical ways of trying to get people to think in a system. And to sort of end on an optimistic note, in my experience, politicians, not civil servants so much, so not permanent secretaries or whatever, but politicians, they're actually very well connected to their users because they see them all the time. So maybe not so much in other countries, but in the UK, every politician of every however far they are up the ladder, they are seeing their constituents probably once a fortnight. So they have a very real connection with those people in a way that I think civil servants and CEOs and people don't. And they may not agree with them, and et cetera, but they do understand, I think, the connection between the user and the thing you're trying to do. The bit in the middle is incredibly vague. But I think they both come at it from that same point of understanding the user. So I think using tools and techniques of design to show a system and a service map or a user journey, showing how the other bits connect. You know, we don't just magically come up with a policy and then it goes straight to the citizens. You know, showing how all those bits connect together is almost something that only designers can do, actually, and can be really, really powerful.
Sorry, I keep mute. That's a great note to end on, Ben, the power and so forth. So thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Ben, for your wonderful thoughts and contribution to this conversation, and greatly appreciate. So thank you so much. And thank you for everybody for attending. Wonderful way to start a conversation. Wonderful Wednesday to have a conversation.
Thank you for bringing us together. And thanks so much to Ben and Nina. I learned loads.
Yes, no, definitely.
Great to meet everyone. Thanks for organizing it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Well,
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.